So thank you guys for coming. So today I am Dr. Lane Dilla. I am an assistant professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. And we, on behalf of the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine Research Committee, are going to have a webinar today with some very talented panelists on developing an emergency medicine research program with funded researchers. So our panelists today are Dr. James Miner, who is the current Chief of Emergency Medicine at Hennepin, and was a previous research director at the Department of Emergency Medicine. His research is focused on pain management, sedation, and monitoring during resuscitation, as well as healthcare delivery. We also have Dr. Newmar, who is the professor and chair of emergency medicine at the University of Michigan Medical Center. His research is focused on both cardiac arrest and traumatic brain injury, with both clinical and basic science elements. We have Dr. Panasek, who is a professor and chair of Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of South Alabama College of Medicine. His prior research has focused on clinical trials in sepsis and critical care. And last but not least, we have Dr. Shah, who is a professor and chair of the Barbie Walsh Department of Emergency Medicine and distinguished chair of emergency medicine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's also the former director of their KL2 program and associate director for the faculty development. His research is focused on improving care for older adults. So we're going to start off with some kind of rapid fire questions for everybody. And then towards the end, we'll leave some room for just open questions up to the viewers. So first off, I'd like to kind of ask, what are the key elements that a department needs to both develop and finance funded emergency medicine researchers? And we'll start off with Dr. Shah.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, Lane. And I would argue that to me, it's five things. You need to have the desire, you need to have the culture, you have the people, the funding, and then finally, importantly, you need to have patience, something that takes time.
And then everybody can jump on kind of as they want, but Dr. Panachek, if you would kind of put your insight as well.
Sure. I think that question is answered both for just having a successful research program as well as successful funded researchers. But along the theme of what Manish just said, I said substrate, skills, system, and support. And by substrate, I mean something to study, subjects, samples, data sets, etc. Skills, I mean research skills. System, a system in place within the institution that facilitates the research and makes it easier for people rather than everyone trying to figure it out and reinvent the wheel themselves. And then a system that supports. You have to have support to prime the pump and get things going. And I think that kind of aligns a fair amount with what Dr. Shah just said, with different words.
Yeah, it seems like infrastructure is a big one that we're going to talk a little bit more on later as well. Dr. Newmar, do you have other thoughts to kind of add of kind of what you think is required?
Sure. I mean, I definitely agree with those general categories. I would say overall, though, the key element is a commitment to creating new knowledge as a core part of the department's mission. And really everything else flows from that, including the investment of resources, the time, the training, and the effort. And without that, commitment to that core mission, then everything else is really, really challenging to do and be successful at. The other things I think, in more modern research, it's really a team sport. So team science is key, which includes, collaboration within the department, but collaboration outside the department, both in research and research mentoring. And one of the things we strive for is a culture where no one who's making the commitment to have a career in as a clinician scientist and putting in the appropriate effort, none of those people should be allowed to fail, and the appropriate amount of support needs to be provided to assure their success.
Yeah. And Dr. Miner, other thoughts?
Well, these have been some great thoughts. It's really cool to hear. I would say one thing I would add to all of that is you kind of have to have all those things at once. Like, you can't give somebody support and time who doesn't like research and have them do research. And no matter how bad somebody wants to get a project done, if you don't give them the time and support, it won't get run right. And so I think that's kind of the key of all these things, is kind of finding them all. And even if you can get them all really small to start, it's better than getting a lot of one and none of the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like infrastructure and having kind of being able to foster that growth within a researcher allows your program to grow as well. So along those lines, I know as residents, we're kind of taught for a path for research career is really residency fellowship, heavy on research, a K award, R award, and yet we're starting to see some more kind of branching out, more society awards, foundation support. What are your guys' thoughts as you're kind of mentoring these people up through the ranks on what is the path or what is really needed in that kind of transitions to succeed? And we can start with Dr. Miner again.
Sure. Well, there isn't the right way to be a great researcher. I mean, you talk to the dean of the medical school, and he sits me down regularly to talk to me about this. He wants NIH-funded researchers, and he makes that a priority for my job as a department chair is to get people funded on NIH research. But there's also, and that's important, but there's also tons of researchers on a lot of other paths, DoD, Department of Justice, industrial paths. I mean, one of the most probably widely published researchers in my department has really never been funded and just kind of piggybacks off the infrastructure of the funded researcher, Brian Driver. He's at industry funding and stuff, but he does some of our best projects just using the intact research staff from mine and Mike Puskarich, Michelle Barros's research. And it's all important and it's all really good stuff. And it can be a fulfilling career and important for the advancement of the science. But the key for building infrastructure is, I think, sustained funding from the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Shaw, I know you mentioned NIH career development awards may increase the success. I was wondering if you would kind of build on that and how you view NIH funding versus these kind of other non-traditional routes for funding.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question in my mind are twofold. One is, do you have the proper training that you need? And meaning either a PhD or some significant, in-depth funding. And then do you have that time and that you need over a number of years to actually build that foundation for your career? And so, the Career Development Award from NIH, the traditional Ks or K-12, KL2, whatever the case might be, is a traditional way of doing it. There are a lot of places also have this funding that's not the NIH. American Cancer Society grants have it. There are a bunch of foundations out there that have it. SAEM has its 2-year award. It's not quite the 4 to 5 years that I would argue you really need to have, but it really just kind of comes down in my mind to you need that time and money to be able to get the proper training you need to be able to do the preliminary work so that you can springboard into an R award or an R level type award.
Yeah. Dr. Newmar, you have a PhD as well. So I'm just curious kind of how you see, especially when we think about training and these awards, PhDs very different. We do less foundation awards, but more NIH traditional path. How does that play in for someone who doesn't have a basic science background?
Yeah, so the traditional pathway you mentioned, definitely has a track record of success, and then therefore really is the lowest risk pathway. So if you really want to go down a pathway where you're, statistically your odds of success are the highest, then going through the K to R pathway really has published data showing those high success rates, although they're not 100%. I mean, maybe where 50 to 60% of people that have done that pathway have gone to R level funding. But people, especially in emergency medicine, have been very successful getting RU grants, other funding, major grants like PCORI without going through that K award pathway. On the opposite end, the riskiest pathway, and the pathway I strongly discourage, is going right from residency directly to a faculty position without having had any substantial research training or a track record of published original research, because on-the-job training with a full-time faculty appointment doesn't work. If you want to get to it can work on unique people, but even if it's someone that can be successful in that, it will take them a lot longer to do it than if they come in with with the dedicated research time, training, and mentorship that you get with a career development award like a K award.
And Dr. Panachek, I know your work has done a lot of clinical trials. I'm curious, especially when we think about developing clinical research, how does this pathway play in? It's a little bit harder, it seems like, and higher risk to be doing clinical trials at early stage K awards, that kind of stuff. What has your experience been with this pathway?
Yeah, I think I've been at multiple places, and I've lived in multiple models with different systems, et cetera, to see, and I've come away from that experience with the conclusion that there's not a one size fits all everywhere, that you really have to understand the landscape of where you are and the resources. Bob's at one of the leading, academic medical institutions in the country with an awful lot of research resources and potential mentors and resources that you can tap into, et cetera. I think they're the more traditional NIH, funding ladder and model makes a lot of sense, as it does in other, top 5% tier academic, funded institutions. But I don't think that model carries over well to other places very well that don't have those resources and those, critical mass of potential mentors there to tap into, et cetera. I actually started out as a bench researcher. So I did a critical care fellowship way back in the day, and I was a large animal researcher in toxic shock back originally, and then septic shock, and looking at lung lymph flows and all this sort of stuff. And back then, the model was that if you were going to be a serious researcher in emergency medicine, you modeled yourself off of a traditional cardiology resuscitation model, like Jim Neiman at Harvard UCLA, or some brain injury, model like Blaine White, and Wayne State, et cetera. I mean, it was kind of traditional models that we were trying to copy. But I think a lot of people, when they moved away from some of those places, realized that model didn't carry over to other places quite so well, and they soured someone on that. And I did too. So I had to get out of the lab. I couldn't translate that capability to a new place. And so I looked around, and I actually asked the question, how do other specialties that don't own an organ system or a procedure or a narrow niche that is clearly their thing, how do they do that? And so I looked at family medicine and divisions of general internal medicine. And as much as emergency physicians don't philosophically identify in a personality way with maybe those specialties too much, they are general specialties that are similar to emergency medicine, and their model has been get usually a master's of public health and epidemiology, do health services research, don't focus on just the lab, be more flexible, be a bit of an opportunist, and collaborate with a lot of other people, et cetera, on things, looking at large population models. And I think in many ways, if you're at the University of Michigan, you can do the traditional model, but I think for many of the rest of us, we need to look more at those models for success. That's how their faculty are successful in those departments and divisions.
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead.
You made me think of a really important comment that's been for Hennepin, is that, at first we couldn't get federal funding. We were at a county hospital. We didn't have the resources. We would write grants and always get rejected. We just didn't have the infrastructure to write it right. It was a losing battle. We had good ideas. We found funding with DARPA and the DOD and the DOJ. We could get funded, but we couldn't get the NIH funding. We had to move over to we moved over to the University of Minnesota as well, and moved our researchers over and our training still at the county hospital. And it just went so much easier. And everyone who's writing a K award right now is actually doing it with a mentor from another department who's been funded, because it just doesn't work without somebody who's been funded before. And we have one of our newer researchers is funded, and he's working on getting his first K awards with other people, but everyone else has gone through other departments where they have a track record, and they love emergency medicine because we already had a nurse group that does 24/7 enrollments, which is like what no one else has. So we 80% of our funding is other departments' grants, just doing work 24/7 and enrolling in the ED that they can't do. So it did take using it. We had to get out of our non-university setting to get that funding.
Yeah, I think you've come up a couple times of the collaboration, both within the department and outside the department. With that in mind, one of the things that at least I've been told as I've come up through the ranks of research in emergency medicine is that it costs the department a significant, and that can be a barrier. So I'm curious kind of what your views are of supporting these researchers as they slowly get their funding, giving them the protected time, the infrastructure. How do you juggle that as a department and still support your researchers? We'll start with Dr. Panachek.
It does cost, no question about it. It's not unique to emergency medicine. I think it costs pretty much all clinical departments that aren't extremely MD, PhD, bench research, heavy. And even then, it often costs because you have to provide salary support in kind or something to actually, pay competitive salaries to some people, certainly in some specialties. But, so does education and administration service. They cost too, and they bring in even less money. And so in the halls of academia, there's arguments all the time about how do you, pay, what's the stipend for an instructor of record for a course or a clerkship or something. I mean, those are arguments that go on in the halls of colleges of medicine all the time. I don't see the research any different. It does cost. And if you're an academic institution, it's part of your mission, and you got to figure out a way for the institution to pay for it. And different places do it in different ways, but it does cost.
Dr. Shaw, I know you had some opinions on this as well. I'm curious if you would mind expressing them.
Yeah, I agree with Ed very strongly. I mean, it's ultimately comes down to what your mission is, right? Our mission is to advance science of emergency medicine, and we're not going to do it unless we invest in doing that. And in this case, the investment is in the people, the investment is doing the research. But there is a return on investment, I would argue. Yeah, it may not be a cash return on investment, but there is a prestige component. There is a component where you can recruit students, you can recruit residents and faculty, and ultimately you make a difference, right? We figure out what the best way to care for a patient, and then you actually implement those interventions. That makes a huge difference. And so, yeah, it does cost money, but so does everything else we do. And this one, I think, is part of our core mission within SAEM, within academic medicine, and so we should do it.
Yeah. Dr. Miner, you seem to be in pretty agreement with that.
Absolutely. I'm very upfront about it with our faculty about what we spend on research and about what we get for it. And I think they appreciate it because for non-researchers, they get to work in a much more stimulating environment when there's research going on. At our university ED, we don't even have residents. We have some med students around, but we have a lot of clinical trials going on, and makes it more fun to work. It's just more interesting than a community job without that. And they know that there's some people that are working less because of that, and they're maybe working a little more because of it to make up the financial difference. But they get what they're getting, and they see those researchers working hard, and I have the researchers present their work a lot and where it's going to go. And if they have great ideas, they help them with the unfunded projects and stuff. And it just makes it a more stimulating place of work and gives people a lot of enjoyment. But it really does help though to be very upfront with people. It happened. We're very much an eat what you kill kind of a financing system. And I just say, this is how much money we put into research every year, and here's how I'm spending it. And everybody likes that. They don't feel like it's some weird thing that they don't have access to. It's not part of their career.
Yeah, I think that being transparent always helps, especially when you're trying to talk with other faculty members about what you are or not doing. Dr. Newmer, you guys have a bit of a large infrastructure. I'm curious what your thoughts are from a financial perspective on cost benefit. Any other additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what's already been said that, if the faculty are in agreement that creating new knowledge is a core mission of the department, then the investment is easy to justify. I will say the bigger your program is, the more expensive it is. So getting bigger doesn't make it any cheaper. There's no economy of scale when it comes to investing in research. So it's important to sort of scale what your ambitions are for the size of your research program, depending on the resources that you're going to have access to, because the danger is trying to grow too big in terms of the people and not have the resources to support and sustain them. And it's a job of the chair to, identify those resources, whether it's going to be from clinical margin, which is getting smaller and smaller, resources available at the institution or the medical school, and philanthropy to make sure that those resources are in place, not only for the early career investigators, but even sustaining mid-career and retaining senior investigators. It's all, the bigger you are, the more it costs, is all I'm going to say.
So oh no, go.
Sorry, Lane, if I could add one piece, I think as people look at the various, academic institutions we have both here, but also just more broadly, you'll see some specialization that occurs, right? So here at Wisconsin, we haven't built a basic science shop, and I would never even try to do that. While Bob's done a phenomenal job building, a top-notch shop. And a lot of this has to do with that. We just don't have the resources for it. We're not going to invest that way. However, we do have a top-notch aging research program here that is very much in line with the broader institution. And so I think it takes some very deliberate vision and strategy on the part of the various institutions. And then I think if somebody's looking to decide where they want to go to join the faculty or where they'd like to apply to join the faculty, they can build off of that to think about what the priorities might be at that institution.
For sure. In terms of the resources at an institution, I'm curious how you guys all have very different kind of geographical and infrastructure, I'm sure, with some similarities. I'm curious how each of you have structured from a departmental level the infrastructure in terms of like recruitment, research assistance, other supports for grant writing, that sorts of stuff. Dr. Newmar, if you would kind of elaborate on the infrastructure you guys had. I know you mentioned some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've done, some of the standard things in terms of, formal launch committees for new faculty, startup packages that give protected time, as well as, research funds to get the work ongoing until they can secure the extramural funding. We have some regular, meetings with our associate chair for research with the early career faculty, just sort of troubleshooting work in progress, kind of monthly meetings for that. The one thing that we have done that's, maybe a little bit different and was very intentional coming in is actually started creating our own centers. So we created initially the, Michigan Center for Integrated Research and Critical Care when I got here. Before I got here, the Injury Prevention Center was created by initially Ron Mayo, Rebecca Cunningham, and Bill Barson. And those centers can get larger levels of support from both the institution and externally. Our Injury Prevention Center is funded by the CDC, for example, and we actually transitioned our Critical Care Research Center into an endowed center. It's now called the Weil Institute for Critical Care Research, with a large naming gift. So there's other innovative ways to sort of build some infrastructure for research programs that has a lot of advantages in sustainability.
Yeah. Dr. Miner, do you have other thoughts to add on that of what's your infrastructure situation like? What have you prioritized or not prioritized?
Currently, we're trying really hard to make centers, watching what really successful places have done, because I think that's a really great way to work. What we've done, the way our infrastructure works is everything's done, all our research is essentially done communally. We have one set of research coordinators that feed into all of our grants, and all of our either other departments actually can hire them as long as they bring in an EM investigator at some level. And that's just efficiency. So now we have 24/7 coverage, and we can enroll all the time. And then for our new researchers, they all do a fellowship. We've never hired anyone that's done a fellowship anywhere else. We would love to. It's just never happened. So our fellows start with really a lot of time and very, very close weekly mentorship. Once somebody is hired as a researcher, they have a very clear amount of time funded by the department with very clear expectations. Well, you're expected to apply for this many grants and do these many projects with residents and have these, just so that there's some guidelines. Everybody exceeds the expectations, but I think just having the guidelines give them some idea of what's going to be expected of them for this time, so they don't get panicky like, I haven't been funded. Because some people will get their first, they write a couple grants and they're funded. Some people can write grants for years. One of my best funded researchers now probably had like a 9-year streak where she was getting started, where she's kind of on some other people's projects but couldn't get her own stuff. When she needed that time, and now she's doing great. It just took some, but she met all the expectations. She published like that. She just wasn't getting, and got on other people's projects. She just wasn't getting her own stuff done. She just needed the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like a lot of community resources within the department to kind of support researchers throughout the stages. Dr. Panachek and Dr. Shaw, do you guys have other thoughts on how you have structured up your systems? Either one of you.
Well, I'll say I've seen it done different ways in different places, and I think you're about to run into the next question, which is more institutional support. And I think this question is departmental support. There are departments that have money and can do a lot of it, and there are departments that have none, and it's highly variable. And so I guess it depends what you have in terms of resources. I've been at places where we had them. I'm in a place right now where we don't. I would ask Bob where the money comes from within his department for the department to support new researchers. Is it your, clinical overage, your chair's tax? Is it endowment funds that you're tapping into, or, where does that money come from?
I guess.
Yes, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, I think, part of it is we get indirects back from 40% of indirects back from federal funding. So that comes back, that helps pay for things like rent and some common, pre-award, post-award staff to manage grants, applications and manage grant, budgets. We have a significant amount of philanthropy, which is really an important pillar for our research infrastructure, both for our critical care research center and our traumatic brain injury work. And we do take we make an investment out of our clinical revenue that helps support that. We've gotten different packages from the dean, like a chair startup package is really a key thing that's important for new chairs going into academically oriented institutions. To I think we typically, as a specialty, under negotiate for those kind of resources, and that's something that we really need to make sure we emphasize, to have those resources to be able to invest in people and programs at the beginning of a role as a new chair as well.
I'm going to partially answer that question and hit one other point, which is that some of it comes down to, if it's the mission of the greater institution, and it's up to the dean to really put up with that. And so, I mean, I've been a chair now for 11 months. And when I was doing my negotiation with the dean here, it was a pretty clear-cut piece of, okay, if we're going to be highly competitive, if I'm going to recruit in X number of junior faculty and get them to the next stage, this is what it's going to take. And, I mean, fortunately, and part of why I was attracted to this place, they said, yes, we're going to support it, and here's how we're going to support that. And so that becomes a major component, at least in my mind, of getting support for this. I think the other piece I would say is really having a very deliberate and organized process to support and coach the junior researchers. We have established promotion oversight committees as well as mentoring teams, and regularly we evaluate how they're doing, that they're getting the proper needs they have, that they're having their needs addressed. Because I think it's very easy for folks to kind of go do their thing and go off in whatever rabbit hole they go off into. But it takes the more senior folks to ensure the steps are getting hit, that the metrics are being hit, and that they're not making, the classic mistakes that all of us have made, or try to minimize those classic mistakes. I'll hold on in terms of institutional, but I think that's the other piece, is really from the institutional side, that you have to really have your eyes open.
So I'll let you move into that next piece, because that is the next question. How do you get buy-in from an institutional level to support both the department infrastructure that seems like is needed to really grow and support research, but also the individual researchers themselves too?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important role of the chair as well as the vice chair of research, to be at those tables and to be involved in those discussions. Obviously, a lot of it drives off mission, if that's the institution's mission. But for those institutions that have clinical and translational science awards, that comes with a ton of infrastructure for your institution in terms of career development awards, in terms of mentee training, research mentee and research mentor training, in terms of curriculum for people that may have whatever type of career development award that they have. I ran the KL2 here for 7-ish years. And we built an entire infrastructure that's open to anyone with a career development award, so that they could really get those skills they need and jump to the next level. And I think that's what we have to make sure we're tapping into from the emergency medicine standpoint, is those other resources. In addition to, and I think it may have been Jim that said this earlier, is tapping mentors in other departments. Everyone in our department that has any type of research track record has mentors in other departments. I even have a research mentor in another department. And that's necessary because we do cross lots of different fields.
Yeah. Dr. Panachek, I'm curious if it differs at all for you, or how you've fostered and really encouraged junior or even mid-career researchers to establish and take advantage of those extra departmental resources at an institutional level.
Yeah, I really agree with some of the comments that have already been made about outreaching and seeking mentors and collaborations outside your department, which is, it's all about team science these days, and team just about everything, I guess. As opposed to the old days of kind of a lone ranger, lone wolf doing it in your lab, with walls up and that sort of thing. So that's really critically important. Again, I've been at multiple places. So the role that support, philosophic support, financial support, and structure support at an institution, the amount that they have makes a huge difference. And a great example is the difference between what I have right here, right now, versus UC Davis. So UC Davis, when the whole Clinical Translational Science Center grants originally went out to establish those places, UC Davis was in that first group of 8 or 10 or whatever it was. And they took that money, and the dean also funded it through feeding back the overhead costs for things. And they built this clinical trials office that turned into an incredible system of tapping into research coordinators, walking into the office of the budget person who would work with the entire budget with you on that, the person who would handle your IRB issues, the ones that would negotiate contracts and rates with industry sponsors for things and help all that. You could take a rather new, naive investigator, but who had a good contact or a good idea, and they could walk into that office and come out with all of those pieces essentially polished for them. That made such a huge difference there, and I wish I had it at my place here right now. We're actually starting to try to build it, but those funding centers, those nodes that came out of that clinical translational or Center for Clinical and Translational Sciences stuff, I think made a huge difference in the clinical research opportunities for emergency physicians and other clinicians to do translational and more clinical rather than bench research at a place. I think that's made a huge difference.
I'm curious, Dr. Miner or Dr. Newmar, have you guys really tapped into the CTSI, those kind of resources at all institutions? Is this becoming a more kind of universal approach to research, or do you feel like there are still institutions that are more kind of isolated and not having access to this?
Yeah, I can just comment from our own experience. We've been engaged in it at a number of levels. Most recently, our CTSI got renewed with it actually got a K-12 program instead of a KL2, which was interesting. But when they got funded, they had they needed to fill 10 slots at the institution, and they wanted applications within 3 months. So we ended up, our department ended up getting 2 of those 10 slots in the institution. Right. So we've been pretty competitive for those kind of things. But the one thing I will add in terms of engaging the institution, and it's definitely important to interact directly with the dean about the research mission and share the vision and get those resources. But getting people into research leadership positions or on the right committees where the decisions are being made about well, first of all, the information is available about what resources are out there, and then the decisions are being made about how they're allocated is really critical. So getting people sort of moving up through the leadership roles. We're very successful in getting people in emergency medicine through hospital administration leadership roles because it's a natural progression, but getting our people into the leadership roles in terms of research is really incredibly valuable. And our our best example is that Rebecca Cunningham is the vice president for research for the whole University of Michigan here. So, having that kind of perspective and leadership also, has people in the room that think about emergency medicine as a partner in the research enterprise and not something that people just forget about.
Oh, you make some really good points. I think we found we get fairly substantial support from the dean's office and CTSI because we're a growing new department. But I think we got it because we just were showing up at a lot of meetings, and it was about the time that we were developing our research infrastructure for StrokeNet. Michelle Bausch was at a meeting, and the neurology or the surgery department was like, "Could we use that for this study?" And now we've got 12 different departments working through our acute care research coordinator team. And it's supported by the CTSI and the dean's office and all these grants, because it always, like Bob was saying, everything costs more. The bigger you get, the more expensive it gets. And the grants fund 80% of it. So all of a sudden your 20% that you're funding gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But being there is what did it, and just offering and just joining in. And people were happy for a partner that stayed up all night and saw people on weekends. And we're there anyway, right? So it's easy. We're the only ones who want to do it. So we've got a big niche where everyone just is happy to pull us in.
Yeah. I think that is one of the unique things about emergency medicine is we are 24/7. We definitely, even here in Colorado, have other departments coming. Can we enroll through the emergency department just because of access of the variety of patients that's unique for us? In terms of like actual writing grants and getting funded, because that is a huge part of it. How have your departments structured grant support? So do you have like a pre-award, someone who's gathering bio sketches, or is that left to the individual researcher? How have you guys figured out how to kind of manage those aspects of research?
Well, here right now, I have none. And we're trying to kind of build that system. At UC Davis, they had a great, very robust grants and contracts office that was very helpful with polishing those things and putting it together. And then that clinical trials office that I mentioned before. It wasn't each department trying to reinvent the wheel and develop their own resources. There was an economy of scale by pooling all of that for the institution that just worked out so incredibly well. So people that are places that can tap into those resources are very fortunate. We're kind of trying to build them here where I am now, but we're not even near that yet. And it has to do with the leadership, from the dean's office on down as to whether that's a priority for them and they're going to support it and put it together, because an individual department doesn't really have the resources to be able to push that through at that scale themselves, no matter how large the department is.
Yeah.
So our department's probably just the next little inch along in terms of support, in that we're new and too small to have a lot of grant writing support for ourselves. So what I did was I partnered with another department and use their infrastructure and just fund it as best I can. And for us, we chose peds. And the reason we chose pediatrics is because not only are they good researchers, but I wasn't worried that like medicine or surgery, they might try to keep us. So I know eventually we'll be big enough to be out on our own, but the other ones made me nervous. But peds has no interest in long-term using us. So I felt safe. So we use the department's infrastructure.
Yeah, Dr. Newmar.
Yeah, that's a great model for it really depends on the volume of work to justify whether you have your own FTEs to do it. When I was back at Penn, we shared it with another department, and that was really very synergistic. Here we have enough work to keep people, pre-award and post-award people busy. So we do have our own staff and director of our Office of Research Management. And they do on the pre-award side, they will pull together bio sketches, other support documents, generate budgets for people that follow the standard format, and help with budget justifications. Obviously, the science is typically written, by the researchers, and then post-award, like each investigator will have a monthly meeting with a grants person to sort of monitor the progress of their grants and their budgets. One of the things that we've done that, again, is leveraging the center philosophy with these multidisciplinary centers is at least our Weil Institute has a proposal development unit, which is actually 2 people that are full-time grant writers. So for these large program grants, maybe, large multi-PI R01s that require, a lot of coordination from multiple departments, we've had people that actually can help be project managers on that and actually even do some of the writing for that and pull together all. If you ever done something like a T32, it's like 150 pages of tables and documents that you got to pull together. So that if you know, once you get to scale, that kind of investment is really has a huge return, because it frees up the investigators to do the scientific components of the awards, and all the other administrative components, which are often a huge barrier, can be taken care of by staff.
Yeah.
I think for us, while we don't have quite everything that Michigan has, some of those resources are actually central within the dean's office that we can tap. And so for larger awards, multi-center, R-level awards and whatnot, we were able to tap project managers from the dean's office. And so that actually becomes very helpful. So for us, it's a little bit of a hybrid. We have pre and post award internal to the department. There's some things that we pull out of the dean's office and some things that live within the CTSA that we're able to pull out of and help our faculty as they're putting the grants in or actually executing the grants.
Yeah. So I know we're starting to get closer to the end of the webinar, so I want to give everybody in the audience a chance to put questions into the chat or unmute yourself and ask them directly. If I don't get a lot of questions, I actually have a couple more questions. So while people are typing in their questions, I'm going to do kind of my last question that I have that I really want answered. One of the things that we struggle with in emergency medicine is burnout and retention in general. And it seems like research may be a little bit higher in some aspects just because the time commitment is significant. And yet research also is protective from burnout. So I'm curious how you guys have kind of pushed retention of more scientists and how you guys view that in terms of the general burnout of emergency medicine clinicians and scientists. Anybody want it? Dr.
I can go first. So two things is, one, you have to give enough time, because research is so time consuming. Most researchers are so devoted, they will kill themselves. When I started out, I tried mostly working night shifts. So I get my research done during the day, and I would have died if I'd kept that up more than a few years. I got a lot done, but I realized it was completely unsustainable, and went to my chair, Joe Clinton, at the time, and said, you need to give me time because this isn't working. So now I just make sure everyone has enough time. But the other thing we do is we make sure we're having fun. So in addition to, we have a journal club for our residents. We have a separate journal club for our research faculty. We get together once a month and we present some research we're all interested in and chat about it, and talk about it, and socialize, and just remember that like what we're doing is really interesting and we wanted to do it, and we all wanted to be scientists when we were little kids, and now we are, and isn't this cool? And it makes a big difference, and we're all friends. We can complain about stuff together, and just outside of the daily work, it really has gone a long way to just regularly, monthly for us, we get together and do that.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I kind of wish we had that here in Colorado. We definitely have our monthly research faculty meetings, and we have EM STEM, which is like where we present our own research, but it's not quite the same. It sounds like there's a little bit more bonding there. Dr. Shaw, you were shaking your head. Other thoughts on retention?
No, so I agree with everything Jim said. We don't quite do that, but it is important to have fun and do things together as a group, and even within a heterogeneous group of researchers. I think the other component in my mind is really, as a chair, as a mentor, in terms of vice chairs of research, is really to highlight the researchers, respect them, support them, and trumpet their successes as much as we trumpet the clinical and educational successes. Make sure they're treated fairly within the comp plan, make sure that we're always trying to find opportunities for them. We talked about earlier, part of the job being in all these committees institutionally is when there's opportunity coming up, being like, hey, I have so-and-so that can do this really easily. Let's get the funding for them, or let's get this for something within my department. And so I think when you set a culture, when you set an environment that is highly collaborative, highly supportive, and fun, people don't want to leave. They want to be where they are. And I think that's an important role for the chairs and vice chairs.
Yeah. Dr. Newmar, do you have other specific activities or thoughts that you guys do in Michigan?
Yeah, a few comments. I mean, I agree with what was said. One of the things we've tried to move away from is the word protected time, because I think it's not protected time. It's like time that you actually work harder in many ways in terms of the effort you put in, and you're up till 2 in the morning writing grants. So dedicated research effort versus protected time is I think a culturally significant way to phrase it. I think, what Manish mentioned is creating community within, the investigators. And so that you need a critical mass of investigators to have community. That doesn't have to be the investigators all in your own department. That's where that sort of team science networking, you can have a very much a sense of community in your research with all your collaborators being in other departments, even outside the medical school. But having that sense of community is what keeps people where they are and makes them less likely to move on. I think as a chair, celebrating successes, as was mentioned, is really important. And making people really, because the rewards are few and far between in research, making sure when they happen that they're acknowledged. And I think the biggest thing in my mind is making sure that our investigators know that I have their back if things aren't working out. I think I've seen people burn out is sort of the chairs telling them, yeah, if you don't get a grant in the next 6 months, you're going to go back to working full-time clinical. And that's sort of puts people into a spiral of despair. And not only that person, but the other people around them that might be aspiring to do research see that happen and get discouraged. So, when you're thinking about the resources you have and the investment you need to have some resources in your pocket to be able to bridge people and maintain their careers when they've invested so much up front and come to a dry spell. So,
Yeah. Dr. Panasek,
Yeah.
I know you're developing a program. What are kind of some key things that you see as part of this?
Yeah, I'll quickly just say that I agree with the other things that they said. I'm not sure what I personally really feel about this whole burnout and emergency medicine thing, other than COVID stresses, et cetera. But at any rate, yeah, having fun, it makes a huge difference. And I see some researchers who never seem to get over that initial hump of frustration with it, and then they drop out and burn out. Maybe they should have never gone in that direction to begin with. So there seems to be like this hump and maybe a couple of humps that you get past, and all of a sudden it's a lot more fun and exciting and intellectually stimulating, and all of those things that people go into it for. But what you need for a successful research program, I'll also provide my perspective from 20 years of the Embers course, et cetera, where there's a lot of people there that seem to be trying to head into a research direction, and some of them are already being tapped to be the research director for their community-based programs or whatever. It's very hard to be a lone wolf and to do this on your own. You need a critical mass of people, whether it's for the fun or the intellectual stimulation or sharing things, etc. You really need a critical mass of people to do that right. So I would go back to what I said at the beginning. You need substrate, something to steal or to study rather. You need the skill sets to be able to do research. You need to be in a structure that is supportive and fosters it. You need to have the support of your department and your institution. And those are the pieces I really think you need. I see people struggling trying to do research that don't really have the skill sets. They're not in a system that has a structure that supports it. They're not given any, startup funds or seed funds or anything to get the ball rolling. They just say, roll up your sleeves and sweat it out on your own, sort of thing. So I think those are the pieces you really need. That's kind of what that's what we built at my last place. And that's kind of what I'm trying, in this last chapter of my academic career, build again here in this place. But to do that, you have to have the support of your superiors, right?
Yeah, for sure. So with that, we're almost at time here. I just want to open it up to our panelists. First, say thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us. I think this has been a really interesting and enlightening discussion, and see if anybody has any kind of last thoughts on how we develop an EM research program and funded scientists. And we'll just start kind of going across my board. Dr. Panacek, I have you first on my screen.
I think you should know the landscape you're in and be realistic. If you're at a top 5% academic institution like Bob is, et cetera, then you've got resources there and you can tap into it. If not, I think you need to be a much more of a realist. You need to be flexible, and you need to be kind of an opportunist. And by an opportunist, I mean you should be looking at funding sources outside of the traditional federal ones, and you should be really looking at mentors and things outside your department, to quickly go outside your department and collaborate with someone else. And I'll go back to that kind of family medicine, general internal medicine, academic faculty success model that they use when they don't own an organ system or something at the NIH. So,
Dr. Miner?
Well, I'd say that one of the keys to just find something you're really passionate and interesting about. Like a lot of us you have to get research done, you have to, but if you're only doing it because you have to do it, it's never going to work very well. And you just, like, no matter what that is, put it aside for a second and find something that you're really interested in, because it's gonna be a lot of work and you're gonna spend a lot of time on it. And if you find it boring or stupid, it's not gonna go anywhere. So you start with that, and then all the other stuff falls into place. And there's no right. I mean, there's a gold standard of what research is supposed to look like, but like advancing science is advancing science, and you get done what you get done and build on it.
Yeah, I think that's key. One of the best pieces of advice I've gotten recently was don't write the grant that you don't want to do. And it sticks with me because there are definitely times when I'm like, oh, but this would be a better science perspective. And yet it's not where I want to go. Dr. Newmar, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I come back to, this idea that, part of our core mission as an academic specialty is to create new knowledge. People that have a sustained research career are people that get career satisfaction out of creating new knowledge. So that's got to be your drive. That's got to be, you have to be driven to do that. I think we have underperformed as a specialty. I understand Ed's comparison to family medicine, but I think we have a potential to contribute to science and research in a way that we're nowhere near our potential. We have access to every single NIH institute in the country through the disease processes that we see and treat in the emergency department. And we have skills and knowledge that people in other specialties don't have, that we can partner with and leverage that to advance the quality of care in the emergency setting. So I think the potential is huge. We just need to advocate for ourselves at our institutions, advocate nationally at federally funding agencies in order to make sure those investments are made. And I'm confident that we're going to grow significantly in the years to come. So it's a good field to go into if you have that drive of creating new knowledge.
Yeah, and Dr. Shaw?
I'm going to build off of Bob's final comment there. I think, the two pieces I would say, one is know your institution and know your community, because there are a lot of resources, a lot of opportunities there. And it's just a matter of getting involved and building upon those. And then the second thing I was going to say is really look to the folks coming up through the system, whether they're doctoral students in departments that relate to the research you're doing, whether the MD, PhD students. These are really critical areas where we can identify folks who are very interested, very smart, get them involved, create postdocs for them, create faculty positions for them, and really build your development pathway there. And so look around and look in your backyard particularly.
Perfect. Well, thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate the discussion. And with that, we'll kind of close it out unless there are any last minute questions, which I didn't see too many questions. I think most people are going to be viewing the webinar in today's age.